The son called his mother too ugly for the wedding and forbade her to come, but he had no idea who she really was. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The morning sun filtered through the sheer lace curtains that framed the small kitchen window, casting soft, warm patterns onto the worn linoleum floor. Mornings were slow now and quiet. Mornings used to mean packing lunches, lacing up little sneakers, and listening for the school bus. Now they meant a kettle whistling gently and the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor. Marilyn James sat at the kitchen table, her weathered hands cradling a chipped porcelain mug of tea. It was mint, her favorite, steeped with a little honey to soothe the dull ache in her chest that came and went like a shadow. Her fingers, curled slightly with age and arthritis, traced the rim of the mug, as if trying to remember something forgotten. The house was silent, except for the creaks of old wood and the distant hum of a lawnmower 2 blocks away. Silence had become her companion, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel. She looked across the room at the fridge, cluttered with old photos and expired coupons. In the center was a yellowing picture of her son, David, age 6, missing his front teeth, grinning up at the camera with wild joy. His cheeks were round then, and he had clutched her hand so tightly the day it was taken. Now he barely returned her calls. Still, she left the picture up. She couldn't bring herself to take it down. That child, not the man he had become, was the one she had poured her entire soul into raising. Marilyn stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked to the narrow closet off the hallway. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender like memory. From the top shelf, she pulled down a box covered in floral paper, carefully labeled with masking tape. David's wedding. She carried it back to the kitchen, placed it gently on the table, and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of folded fabric, pale lavender with a sheen of silver thread running along the hem. She ran her fingers across it, the dress she'd been hand-sewing for weeks. The fabric was soft but sturdy, just like she had once been. She had chosen the color carefully. Not white, not black, something graceful and quiet. The sleeves were long, the collar modest, adorned with 3 pearl buttons she had salvaged from an old blouse. Each stitch in the dress was placed with care, each hem pressed with hope. She had imagined herself sitting in the back row of the ceremony, hands folded in her lap, smiling gently at her son, who would glance back and see her there and nod as if to say, "I see you, Mama." That image had warmed her through many lonely nights. David hadn't told her much about the wedding. The date, yes. The location, vaguely. He had mentioned a vineyard, some grand place outside of Atlanta where everything was going to be tasteful and elevated. Marilyn didn't need details. She didn't want to intrude. She just wanted to be there. That was all. She had already imagined herself taking a bus out to the venue, sitting quietly, blending in. She didn't expect to be introduced, didn't want to be photographed, just wanted to bear witness. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the spool of thread, the needle already waiting in the cushion beside her. She resumed stitching the sleeve, slow and deliberate. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the magnolia tree in the front yard. A bird called out, a long and haunting note that echoed down the street. As she worked, her mind wandered back through the decades. She remembered the first time she held David, a tiny, squirming thing with a strong grip and lungs that filled the hospital room. She had been so young then, not yet 30, with a husband who came home less and less, who grew quieter as her belly grew round. When he died in a car crash one rainy night, Marilyn was left with grief, bills, and a child who looked just like him. She had chosen to survive. For David. There were years of working double shifts at Grady Hospital, scrubbing floors and checking charts, learning how to stretch dollars into meals, turning thrift store finds into Christmas magic. David never knew they were poor. He had school supplies every year, shoes that fit, birthday cakes made from scratch. She made sure of it. She'd stayed up late many nights mending his school uniform, falling asleep with pins in her lap and the hum of the sewing machine still in her ears. David had always been bright, curious, a quiet boy who read everything he could get his hands on. She remembered how proud he'd been when he got his scholarship to Emory, the first in their family to go to college. Marilyn had cried quietly in her car after dropping him off at his dorm, and then gone straight to her shift, wiping her tears with a napkin from the glove compartment. He had called at first, every Sunday like clockwork, then every other week, then not at all. Marilyn didn't complain. She told herself he was busy, that he was building something. She liked to think he was happy. He had sent a photo once of himself in a sleek gray suit, standing on the steps of a courthouse. She had framed it and put it on the mantel beside his graduation photo. That was before he met Victoria. Marilyn had only met her once, briefly, at a dinner 2 years ago. Victoria had been polite, distant. She spoke like someone reading a resume. There had been something in her eyes, a calculation maybe, that unsettled Marilyn. She had tried not to judge. People came from different worlds, and love could bridge that. She had believed that. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was early afternoon. David hadn't mentioned coming by. Her heart lifted slightly. Maybe he was stopping in to show her the invitation, or to talk about the wedding details. Maybe he was bringing Victoria so they could all sit down and talk finally. She stood, smoothing the front of her dress, and went to the door just as the knock came. She opened it, and there he was, taller than she remembered, with that same strong jaw, clean-shaven, sharply dressed. Behind him stood Victoria, slim in a beige trench coat, sunglasses perched atop her head like a crown. "Hi, Mama," David said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He kissed her cheek, quick and light, like a man shaking hands with a stranger. "Hello, Mrs. James," Victoria added with a nod, her eyes already scanning the living room. Marilyn's heart tightened, but she smiled, stepped back, and gestured them inside. "I was just about to put the kettle back on. Would you like some tea?" David glanced at Victoria. "We won't be long." She nodded and took a seat on the edge of the couch. Victoria remained standing. Marilyn sat too, folding her hands in her lap, her pulse quickening. She could feel something was wrong, but she pushed the thought aside. David looked uncomfortable. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt. "We came to talk about the wedding." "Oh," Marilyn said, her smile hopeful. "Of course. I've been sewing my dress, you know, lavender with pearls. I'll sit in the back, won't be a bother." David cleared his throat. "It's just, Victoria and I were thinking." She waited. "We've decided it might be better if you didn't attend," he said. Marilyn blinked. The room went still. He continued quickly, as if rehearsed. "It's not personal. It's just that the ceremony is going to be very curated. Modern. Clean lines. We're trying to maintain a certain aesthetic, and," Victoria chimed in, "it's really about the vibe, Mrs. James, and your condition, with the scarf and everything, it might be distracting for the guests. We don't want people to feel uncomfortable." The words struck her like stones. David avoided her eyes. "We'll send you pictures. We'll even FaceTime you for the vows. That way, you'll still be a part of it." Marilyn sat frozen. The walls around her seemed to press inward. She swallowed hard. Victoria crossed her arms. "After the honeymoon, we'd be happy to look into a care facility for you. Something quiet, clean, peaceful." Marilyn stared at her son, the boy she had rocked to sleep, the boy who had clung to her hand in the rain. He didn't speak. She stood slowly, her body trembling not from illness, but from something deeper. "I see," she whispered. David gave her a weak smile. "You understand. This is for the best." They left shortly after. No hug, no second glance. Marilyn stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared. The tea had gone cold, the cookies untouched. She walked back into the kitchen, sat at the table, and looked down at the lavender fabric in her lap. Her hands, still for the first time in hours, slowly closed over the dress. And then, for the first time in a long while, Marilyn James began to plan. The next morning began the same as all others, with the soft hush of the neighborhood waking outside Marilyn's front window and the kettle steaming softly on the stove. Yet, everything inside her was changed. The air in her house, once a silent companion, felt weightier now, thick with things unspoken. Her chest was hollow with a quiet pain she couldn't name, a place where something tender had been pulled away and replaced with something jagged. She hadn't slept. Not truly. Her body had rested, but her mind had turned endlessly, looping through David's words like a needle stuck in a groove. It's about the aesthetic. You make people uncomfortable. We'll FaceTime you. The way he said it, so calm, so removed, had struck her harder than she had expected. It was like listening to a stranger wearing her son's face, using a tone that no longer belonged to the boy who once used to leave crayon hearts on her pillow. She sat at the kitchen table in her nightgown and robe, unmoving, the lavender dress folded beside her like a question she no longer had an answer for. The room around her looked the same. Faded yellow wallpaper, an old calendar still turned to last month, a stack of mail she hadn't opened. But something essential had shifted. She wasn't sure if it had broken or crystallized. When the morning light began to stretch into the kitchen, she finally stood. The movement was stiff, her back aching in the usual places, her feet cold against the linoleum. She poured the untouched tea from the night before down the sink and rinsed the mug. She turned off the radio without listening to the preacher. Then she walked to the hall closet, opened the door, and pulled down a small dusty suitcase from the top shelf. She carried it into the living room and placed it beside the coffee table, then paused. The house was quiet, but her thoughts were not. She thought about packing, not for a trip, but for a kind of reckoning. The truth was, she didn't know what to do next. She only knew that the world had turned cold and she had been left to feel the frost. That afternoon, she walked into the bedroom and opened the drawer of her nightstand. Beneath her Bible and the reading glasses she rarely used anymore was a key. Small, tarnished, but familiar. She hadn't touched it in years. It belonged to the filing cabinet in the basement. The one she had locked after David left for college. The one filled with things she'd once thought were too important to forget, and too painful to look at. Descending the stairs to the basement, she moved slowly, holding the wooden handrail for balance. The air down there was cooler, damper, filled with the earthy scent of old paint and cardboard. She flicked on the overhead light and found herself staring into the dimness of her past. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall, its surface dusted with a fine layer of time. She crouched slowly, the movement straining her knees, and unlocked the bottom drawer. It creaked as it opened, a familiar protest, and she found the folder almost immediately. It was thick, labeled in her own script, Final. She carried it upstairs, back to the kitchen, and placed it carefully on the table. She took a breath and opened it. Inside were decades of documents, property deeds, savings account ledgers, stock certificates, her will. She turned the pages one by one, the quiet rustle of paper the only sound in the room. She hadn't thought of herself as wealthy, not in any traditional sense. Her furniture was worn, her shoes had been repaired more times than she could count, and she still used coupons at the market. But as she traced the numbers and letters on those pages, she realized the truth. She had built something. 2 rental homes, fully paid off, each bringing in income for years. A savings account with over $100,000, grown patiently through deposits from her nurse's wages, dividends, and the monthly rent checks she'd never spent. A small investment in a beauty salon that had blossomed into a thriving local business. And the life insurance policy, modest, but more than enough for anyone to feel its weight. It was strange, she thought, how wealth could sit so quietly in a drawer while your life moved on without it. She had always thought of these assets as something for David. Not because he asked for it, he never did, but because she wanted him to know she believed in his future. Because she thought that a mother's love was best expressed in the things she left behind. But now the silence between them had turned into something else. Not absence, but rejection. She picked up the will. Her signature was there, firm and neat, right above David's name, the only beneficiary. She stared at it for a long time. Then, with a kind of resolve that settled deep into her bones, she reached into the drawer, pulled out the gold letter opener David had once given her when he graduated law school, and began to slice the paper in clean, deliberate lines. She didn't cry, not even when the name of the boy she had raised disappeared beneath her fingers. Not even when the last page fell in 2. Instead, she felt something else. Lightness. Like the air had finally returned to the room. The sun had dipped low by the time she stood again. The folder now sat empty on the table, and she took it to the fireplace and fed the pieces one by one into the flames. The papers curled and blackened, edges glowing orange before turning to ash. When the last piece had burned, she stood in the flickering light and whispered to the room, "Thank you for showing me who you really are." That night, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark with her flannel robe pulled close, the warmth of the fire against her skin. She listened to the wind against the windows, the settling creaks of the house. And she waited. For what, she didn't yet know. The next morning, she dialed a number she hadn't called in months. It rang twice. "Gloria Chambers," came the voice, groggy with sleep. "Gloria, it's me," Marilyn said, her voice steady. "I need you to come by. Today, if you can." There was a pause. "You all right?" "No," she replied, "but I will be." Gloria arrived just after 3. She didn't knock. She never had. They had been friends since 19, back when they sang in the choir together and believed in the kind of happy endings only hymns promised. Gloria was sturdy, with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She carried a black briefcase and 2 folders. Marilyn led her to the kitchen. "I brewed tea," she said, "but it's cold now." "Doesn't matter," Gloria replied, sitting down. Marilyn pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and slid it across the table. The handwriting was shaky in places, but the instructions were clear. "I'm changing everything," she said. Gloria opened the pad, read for a moment, then nodded. She pulled out a clean set of documents and began to write. Marilyn watched her for a long moment. "Do you remember why I started saving money?" Gloria didn't look up. "You said you wanted to make sure David never went without." "That was part of it," Marilyn said, "but it was more than that. I saw too many women go out broke, women who worked as hard as I did, who gave their lives to people who never once looked back. I told myself I wouldn't be one of them." "You won't," Gloria said, her pen moving. "You're going out loud." Marilyn smiled, but it was small, hollowed. By the time the documents were complete, her hands were shaken from the effort of signing. But her name, Marilyn V. James, still flowed from the pen, one letter at a time. Everything, every cent, every asset, every deed was now going to a small foundation she had volunteered for decades ago, a shelter for elderly black women abandoned by their families. Women who, like her, had once believed love meant forever, who had once been mothers. The foundation had once been called Rose Hill. It was now being renamed. She had made sure of that. And, as Gloria sealed the final envelope and placed it in her bag, Marilyn folded her hands, leaned back, and said quietly, "He wanted me gone, invisible. Not today." And for the first time in days, she felt warm. That night, after Gloria had left with the signed documents neatly tucked inside her briefcase, Marilyn sat alone in the dim light of her living room. The fireplace had gone out hours earlier, and the chill of the evening crept through the old window panes like a quiet reminder that even spring could be cold when you were alone. Her tea had gone cold. The lavender dress lay folded in its box, undisturbed, and the house was as silent as it had ever been. She didn't turn on the television. There was no radio humming in the background. Even the old wall clock, which had ticked faithfully for decades, seemed quieter, as if honoring the solemnity of the moment. She sat very still, hands resting in her lap, fingers lightly folded as if in prayer. Not the kind of prayer that asks for miracles, but the kind that simply asks for strength. In the silence, her mind wandered, not forward, but back. Memory was a treacherous gift. It could warm you, like sunlight on skin, or it could wound, sharp and sudden as broken glass beneath your heel. And tonight, Marilyn's memory carried her to the early days of raising David, when he was just a boy and she was still full of hope, still full of dreams that hadn't yet frayed at the edges. She remembered one winter in particular. He had been 8, maybe 9. They hadn't had much, and the gas heater had gone out during a stretch of bitter cold. She had bundled him in 2 sets of pajamas and 3 blankets, and together they'd huddled in the bed, their breath visible in the air. David had whispered, "It's like camping, Mama," and she had smiled and said, "That's right, baby, just like camping." He had fallen asleep, content, and she had stayed awake all night, afraid that if she dozed off, he might not wake again. That had been her life, always watching over him, always sacrificing, always loving with a fullness that had no boundaries. And now, in her final years, she had been reduced to an inconvenience in his life. A footnote he wanted to edit out. The ache of that truth sat heavier than any illness in her chest. She rose slowly, her joints stiff and reluctant. The clock read just past midnight, and the air felt thick with things unsaid. She lit a small lamp on the hallway table, casting a faint golden glow, and walked to her bedroom. There, tucked into the far corner of her closet, was a pair of old slippers and a wool shawl she hadn't worn in years. She pulled them out, wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, and reached for the key. It was time. The basement door creaked open with its usual resistance. The wooden stairs moaned beneath her careful steps, and the smell of earth and old fabric enveloped her like a forgotten coat. She hadn't been down here in a long time. Not since before David moved away. Not since before her body started to betray her. The filing cabinet stood in the far corner, squat and sturdy, its once black paint now dulled to charcoal. Dust covered the top, thick and undisturbed. Marilyn ran her fingers along its surface, drawing a clean line through the grime. Then, with a slow breath, she bent down, inserted the key, and opened the bottom drawer. It groaned as it slid open. Inside were layers of files, organized and labeled with a precision that surprised even her. Old tax returns, medical documents, school papers, and beneath them all, a manila folder with the word "Final" scrawled across it in bold black ink. She pulled it out with care, her hands trembling slightly. The folder was heavier than she remembered. She carried it back upstairs, her steps deliberate, steady. In the kitchen, she laid it flat on the table and opened it. The first thing she saw was her own handwriting, notes to herself, written years ago, reminding her to update her accounts, to check on the property taxes, to renew the lease agreements. Then came the documents themselves. Deeds to the 2 rental homes she had bought over the years, each fully paid off and still bringing in monthly rent. Statements from the credit union where she had kept her savings, a balance well into 6 figures. The original partnership agreement for the beauty salon she had helped her friend Sheila open, where Marilyn still quietly owned a 20% stake. The insurance policies, the investment certificates, and tucked at the very back, the now destroyed will. She stared at the empty line where David's name had once appeared, the spot where she had signed her legacy over to him without hesitation, believing that love and sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. How naive she had been. She sat there for a long time, the folder open before her, a world of value she had built 1 penny, 1 hour, 1 decision at a time. No one had known, not even David. Especially not David. She had always meant it to be a surprise, a final gift to him, a way to say, "Even when you weren't looking, I was thinking of you." But now that thought tasted bitter. It stung. She imagined the look on his face when he found out he'd been disinherited. She didn't imagine it out of spite or triumph. She imagined it because she wanted to believe there would still be some part of him that would be hurt, some part of him that would regret, not because of the money, but because of what it meant. Because it meant he had chosen someone else over her. It meant he had discarded her, not out of necessity, but out of shame. Her hands moved slowly as she reassembled the folder, closing it with care. She placed it back in the cabinet, locked it again, and returned the key to her pocket. Then she went to the sewing drawer beneath her bedroom window. Inside was a bundle of cash, emergency money, wrapped in rubber bands, carefully labeled. She added it to the list she had given Gloria earlier. She would leave nothing to chance. The next morning, she called Sheila, her longtime friend and partner in the salon. "Sheila," she said, her voice firm but kind, "you've always loved that place more than anyone. It's yours now. It always should have been." Sheila's voice cracked. "You don't have to." "I do," Marilyn interrupted, "because I'm not leaving behind anything for people who don't see me. I'm leaving it for the ones who do." That afternoon, she went through her closets. She pulled out old letters David had written to her from college, now faded and folded soft at the edges. She placed them in a shoebox, along with the birthday cards she had saved, the Mother's Day drawings, the programs from every graduation he had invited her to. She sat with them in her lap for an hour, maybe more, then carried them outside and fed them to the burn barrel behind the house. She didn't cry. She watched the flames consume the past with a strange clarity. The smoke curled into the air, carrying years of love and disappointment with it. That night, she wrote 2 more letters. One to David, explaining in careful, deliberate language why he would no longer inherit anything, not out of anger, but out of understanding. She had finally accepted the truth of who he had become. The second letter was addressed to Victoria. It was shorter. In it, she warned her that marrying a man for money meant knowing whether the money was truly his to give. She placed both letters in envelopes, sealed them, and wrote their names on the front in ink that bled slightly into the paper. Then she handed them to Gloria the next day, along with a small black purse containing tissues and a bottle of water. "Give them these after the ceremony," she said. "Let them smile for the cameras. Let them believe the world is theirs, and then give them the truth." Gloria didn't argue. She simply nodded. As she left, Marilyn stood at the window, watching the car disappear down the street. The house behind her was still. The lavender dress still sat in its box, untouched. In the days that followed, she prepared quietly. She bathed more slowly, dressed with more care, ate smaller meals. The strength in her legs waned, and her heart fluttered more often than it used to. But her eyes, when she looked in the mirror, were clear. They had always said death was a kind of leaving. But Marilyn had already left. She had walked away from the expectations placed upon her, from the silence that had suffocated her, from the roles she had filled until they no longer fit. She was no longer waiting to be seen. She was ready to show herself. The morning sky was a muted gray when Marilyn woke, the kind of sky that held back the sun as if in mourning. She sat up slowly, her body aching more than usual, the stiffness spreading from her spine down to her calves. Her hands, curled slightly with sleep, took a moment to respond, the joints tight and reluctant. Still, she moved with purpose. There was work to do. She made her way to the bathroom, splashed water on her face, and stared into the mirror. The woman looking back at her was older, thinner, and smaller than the one she remembered being. Her skin, once the warm tone of deep cinnamon, now had a pallor beneath it, like paper with its color faded. Her hair, once thick and defiant, lay beneath her scarf, fine and sparse. But her eyes were alive, more alive than they had been in years. There was no grief in them anymore, no sadness, only purpose. She dressed with care that morning. A navy blue skirt, pressed and clean, and a matching cardigan with one missing button she'd meant to sew on, but never had. She placed her brooch, the one her grandmother had left her, on her lapel. It was a dove in flight, silver and worn at the edges, with a single pearl for its eye. She had worn it to every significant moment in her life. She wore it now not because this was an ending, but because this was a declaration. When Gloria returned just before noon, she carried not only her briefcase but also a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in newspaper. "For your table," she said simply, placing them in an empty jar beside the window. Then she sat and opened her case. They didn't need to speak much. Marilyn handed her a second legal pad, one she had written in over the course of 3 long nights. The instructions were specific, deliberate, thorough. Gloria's eyes moved over the pages, and then she nodded. "All of it to Rose Hill," Marilyn said quietly. "Every cent, every deed, every holding. I want the salon to stay open. Put Sheila's name on the lease. She'll know what to do with it." Gloria adjusted her glasses. "You sure you don't want to leave a portion for emergencies? A contingency fund? I've had my emergencies, Marilyn replied. I survived them all. This isn't about me anymore. Gloria paused. And David? Marilyn didn't hesitate. He's had enough. It took hours to prepare the documents, each line written with the kind of care that came from two women who had known what it meant to be ignored, who had learned that if you didn't write your own story, someone else would write it for you, and get it wrong. While Gloria worked, Marilyn moved slowly around the house, collecting the few items she wanted to remain behind. A quilt her mother had sewn from pieces of her father's shirts, a family Bible with names written in curling script, a hand mirror cracked at the corner but still reflecting. She dusted off each object, not as if she were preserving a legacy, but as if she were closing a chapter. She paused when she came to the shoebox under her bed, the one filled with letters she had written for David over the years. Each birthday, each milestone, each sorrow. Some were full of love, others filled with stories she had never told him. All of them were written in a mother's hand, meant to be discovered after she was gone. She had once imagined him sitting in her empty house, reading each one in turn, and feeling the weight of her love finally settle on him like a warm blanket. But now, she carried the box into the kitchen and set it beside the trash can. She didn't throw it away yet, but she would. Not out of vengeance, but out of release. When the new will was complete, Gloria slid it across the table. Marilyn picked up the pen, her fingers trembling slightly, and signed her name. The letters wavered, but remained legible. Underneath, Gloria added her witness signature and then stamped the document with her notary seal. It was done. Everything Marilyn had spent her life building, carefully, quietly, stubbornly, was now redirected, not toward blood, but toward purpose. I want the foundation to use the money for housing first, Marilyn said, her voice steady. No woman should have to grow old and fear the streets. Then medical care, dignity. God knows we've all worked hard enough to deserve that. I'll make sure it happens, Gloria said. Marilyn nodded. And I want them to rename the main building, not after me, but after the women it's for. The forgotten ones, the ones nobody comes to visit. Gloria smiled. They'll call it whatever you want. They sat in silence for a while, the papers stacked between them like a final bridge. You know, Gloria said eventually, he's going to be furious. Marilyn chuckled softly. He'll be fine. He has his charm and his ambition. He'll land on his feet. And Victoria? Marilyn's expression darkened. She'll leave him before the week is out. I don't know, Gloria said thoughtfully. That one seems like the kind who can fake affection for a very long time, if the money's right. Then it's a good thing the money's wrong, Marilyn replied, her voice firm. Later, Marilyn retrieved the 2 envelopes from the drawer and handed them to Gloria. Hold on to them, she said. Give them the day of the wedding, after the ceremony, after the pictures. Let them smile first. You really want to do it that way? Gloria asked. I don't want to humiliate him, Marilyn said, but I want him to remember me. Not as the woman he left behind, but as the woman who didn't stay small. Gloria looked at her old friend for a long time. Then she placed the envelopes carefully in her briefcase. When she left, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the front steps. Marilyn stood in the doorway, watching the light shift over the grass, the trees, the sidewalk that had carried her son to school every morning when he was small enough to still wave goodbye. She didn't cry. She felt no need to. That night, she gathered the shoebox and tore the letters one by one. The one for his 30th birthday. the one for the day he might become a father, the one she had written after her first surgery, filled with hope and apology and quiet desperation. All of them, fed piece by piece into the trash. She didn't burn them. She let them go quietly. She kept one, though, the very first one she had written, the one from the night he left for college. It was wrinkled at the corners, stained with the ink of a pen that had sputtered and bled. She read it once more. It said simply, "If the world ever makes you feel small, remember you came from me. You were born of strength. Don't forget it." She folded it and placed it in her dresser drawer, not for him, for herself. In the days that followed, Marilyn began to move through her routines with a new rhythm. She walked slowly through her garden, plucking weeds with quiet satisfaction. She drank her tea with more intention. She answered the phone less. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to defend. On Sunday, she went to church. She wore her lavender dress, pearl earrings, and the silver dove brooch. No one asked why she looked different. No one noticed that she took communion with her eyes closed a little longer than usual. But she felt it, deep inside, the peace of a woman who had finally spoken her full truth, even if no one else had heard it yet. After service, she spoke with a few of the other women, the ones who sat near the back and wore the same hats they'd worn for years. They laughed gently together, shared recipes, and compared medications. No one talked about weddings. No one mentioned David. It was a kind of grace, and when she returned home, the house welcomed her not with silence, but with calm. She brewed a fresh pot of tea, buttered a slice of cornbread, and sat at the table where the will had been signed, where the letters had been sealed, where the legacy had been rewritten. She opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "I am not someone you forget." Then she closed it and smiled. She had no more need for reminders. The morning of the wedding arrived with the sky stretched open and pale, a flawless blue that had not yet been touched by the sun. It was the kind of day photographers dreamed of, clear, warm, touched by the faintest breeze, promising beauty in every frame. Birds trilled in the distance, their calls echoing like blessings across the quiet neighborhoods and winding highways that led away from the city and toward the vineyard. Marilyn had risen before dawn. Her body ached with the quiet warnings of age and illness, but her movements were measured, not rushed. She bathed in warm water, letting the heat sink into her joints, her hands lingering on her skin as though memorizing it. She dressed slowly, with care, choosing a soft gray suit with a high neckline and a gentle flare to the skirt. It was simple, elegant, and dignified, what she might have worn to church on Easter Sunday in better years. She wrapped her head in a deep blue scarf threaded with silver stitching, each turn of the fabric deliberate, ceremonial. It shimmered faintly in the light, and when she pinned it into place, she reached for the brooch her mother had given her on the day she graduated from nursing school. The silver dove, now slightly tarnished, still caught the light. She placed it just above her heart. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the ghost Victoria had tried to paint her as. She saw a woman who had lived, a woman who had survived. Her skin was thin, yes, and her frame smaller than it had once been, but her eyes remained unbroken, still hers, still sharp, still watching. Gloria arrived promptly at 9. She wore a navy pantsuit and low heels, her briefcase clasped in one hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't say much, only greeted Marilyn with a nod and helped her into the car. As they drove, the city fell away behind them. The buildings gave way to trees, the sidewalks to hills. Marilyn sat in silence, her hands folded over a small black purse. Inside were tissues, a bottle of water, and a second envelope, this one addressed to Victoria. The other, the one meant for David, was already in Gloria's briefcase. The vineyard appeared suddenly, tucked between two ridges, its long rows of green vines stretching toward the horizon like ribs beneath the earth's skin. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires as Gloria pulled the car into a discreet space near the back of the guest parking area. Marilyn sat for a moment before getting out. Her breath was shallow, her heart a slow, steady drum. Gloria came around to help her, offering an arm, and together they made their way up the path toward the gathering crowd. The vineyard had been transformed. Ivory tents billowed in the breeze, strung with delicate lights and hung with gauze like something from a dream. Guests in pastel suits and champagne-colored dresses milled about, their laughter rising like music. A quartet played jazz under a floral arch. Servers in white jackets moved like shadows, offering trays of cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. No one noticed the woman in gray with the cane. No one turned their head to see the scarf or the dove pin. No one recognized her, and that, in itself, was a kind of grace. Gloria led her to the designated family section, third row from the front, near the aisle but not too close. Quietly, of course, the invitation had said, "Please sit in the designated family section and respect the couple's wishes." Marilyn had smiled when she read it, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Now, she sat as instructed, her purse on her lap, her hands folded neatly, her gaze steady on the altar ahead. The ceremony began 15 minutes later. First came the officiant, a white-haired man with a velvet voice and a practiced air. He welcomed the guests, spoke of love, of unity, of honoring those who helped us become who we are. Marilyn's eyes didn't leave the platform. Then David emerged. He was dashing, poised, every inch the image of success. His suit was tailored to perfection, his posture proud. Applause rose around him as he walked down the aisle, nodding to friends and colleagues, smiling his polished smile. But he didn't look back. Not once. Marilyn didn't flinch. Victoria followed moments later. Her gown shimmered like liquid glass, tight and sculpted, her veil trailing behind her like a whisper. She moved with practiced elegance, her hand on her father's arm, her smile radiant. The crowd sighed, enchanted. Marilyn didn't sigh. She watched, measured, remembered. The vows were long. Victoria choked up during hers, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief. David spoke with charm and gravity, his voice warm. There was laughter at the right moments, murmurs of approval. They exchanged rings. They kissed. The guests erupted in applause. Marilyn did not clap. She remained seated. Gloria leaned toward her. "Now?" "Not yet," Marilyn whispered. The couple turned, hand in hand, triumphant, and walked back down the aisle as husband and wife. Flashbulbs burst around them. Guests rose to their feet, throwing petals and cheers into the air. Marilyn sat still, her body calm, her face unreadable. After the ceremony, the reception began. The tent flaps were drawn back, revealing long tables adorned with roses and candles. Waiters uncorked bottles of champagne. Laughter rose again, and the music changed to something light and celebratory. David and Victoria stood near the floral arch, posing for photographs, radiant in the golden light. Marilyn gave a single nod. Gloria rose, took the envelope from her briefcase, and walked forward. The crowd parted politely as she approached. A few glanced at her, but most remained focused on the couple. When Gloria reached them, she smiled politely and said, "Congratulations. This is for you, from your mother." David blinked. Victoria turned, puzzled. Before either of them could respond, Gloria handed the second envelope to Victoria and walked away without another word. Marilyn watched from her seat. David opened his envelope. His smile faltered almost instantly. Confusion passed across his features, then disbelief. His hands trembled as he turned page after page. The new will, the proof of donation, the foundation name, the letter written in Marilyn's hand, explaining everything. Victoria frowned, opened hers, and read the short note addressed to her. "You looked me in the eye and told me I didn't belong. I'll leave you nothing. If you married him for his inheritance, I suggest you change your dress and your life." She paled. Voices around them lowered. The music did not. The quartet continued to play as if unaware. Victoria turned sharply. "What the hell does this mean?" David didn't answer. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked around, panicked, his eyes scanning the crowd as if seeking someone, something. And then he saw her, Marilyn, sitting calmly in the third row, her scarf bright beneath the sun, the dove on her chest gleaming. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood, slowly, her cane steady beneath her hand, and turned. She walked away. Behind her, Victoria was yelling. David tried to speak, to follow, but the guests were staring now. Phones lifted. Whispers spread. The photographer lowered his camera. Gloria had already returned to Marilyn's side. "It's done," she said softly. Marilyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. Let them smile for the camera, she thought. Let them toast and pose and believe this day is theirs. Because everything after this moment belongs to me. By the time Marilyn and Gloria had left the vineyard and reached the quiet road leading back toward the city, the sun had begun to soften, its golden hue dissolving into a cool haze that signaled the approach of evening. The wind stirred the tall grasses along the roadside, and the silence inside the car was warm, heavy, and full. Marilyn sat back in her seat, hands folded neatly in her lap, her scarf slightly loosened at the base of her neck, the brooch still glinting like a small badge of victory. She didn't speak, and neither did Gloria. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said had already been sealed in letters, handed off, and felt in the tremor of David's hands as he read what his mother had written. The image of his face, frozen, pale, uncertain for the first time in years, lingered in Marilyn's mind, not with triumph, but with finality. When they arrived at Marilyn's house, the porch light had already flicked on. The motion sensor buzzed faintly as she stepped onto the walkway, and she paused at the threshold, glancing briefly at the street behind them. The road was empty. No cars followed, no voices called, just the hum of the cicadas and the steady rhythm of her own breath. Inside, the house welcomed her with its old familiarity. The scent of lemon polish still faint from her cleaning earlier that week, the curtains drawn against the late sun, the radio silent on the kitchen counter. She set her purse on the table and removed her shoes with slow, practiced motions, placing them carefully beneath the bench where she had always stored them. Gloria lingered in the doorway, her briefcase closed now, her shoulders relaxed. She looked at Marilyn, not with pity, but with something deeper, respect. "Will you be all right?" she asked. Marilyn smiled. It was small, tired, but real. "I already am." Gloria nodded. "If you need anything, you call me." "I know." And with that, her friend left, the door closing gently behind her, leaving Marilyn alone with the quiet she had grown used to, but which now felt different. Not heavy, not hollow, just hers. She stood for a moment in the center of the living room, eyes roaming across the familiar shapes of furniture, photos and the folded lavender dress still resting in its box by the corner. She didn't move toward it. She no longer needed to. It had served its purpose, just as she had. That night, Marilyn brewed herself a pot of tea, strong, unsweetened, earthy, and carried it out onto the back porch. The sky was ink blue above, stars emerging one by one, and the moon, thin and curved like a blade, hovered low on the horizon. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and settled into the wicker chair she hadn't used in years. She sipped slowly. She listened. Inside the house, all the clocks ticked in unison. No televisions, no messages, no interruptions. Peace. The following morning, the world began to talk. It started quietly, like a ripple in a still pond. A post on social media. A guest from the wedding who had recorded Victoria's outburst without meaning to, her voice sharp and panicked. Another post from someone who had recognized Marilyn from a community event years ago, adding context. Then a screenshot of a quote from the letter David had received, already circulating online. "You told me I was too ugly to be seen at your wedding. And that's when I realized I didn't fail as a mother. You failed as a son." By noon, the story had been picked up by a local news blog. By the next day, national outlets had rewritten it into clickbait headlines and dramatic retellings. A photo of Marilyn, taken years ago at the Rose Hill Foundation's annual dinner, appeared beside articles titled "The Mother Who Left Her Fortune to Strangers After Her Son Disowned Her." Donations to the foundation surged overnight. Women began writing in, emails, letters, social posts, all echoing the same refrain. "I see myself in her. I've been forgotten too." They used hashtags, hundreds of them, that bloomed like wildflowers across the internet. Hash, Marilyn deserved more. Hash, not your burden. Hash, mother's errand to invisible. The Rose Hill Foundation changed its homepage within days, featuring Marilyn's story, her contributions, and her decision to name the new housing wing Massey Hall after her maiden name. The dedication plaque read, "In honor of every woman who was told to be silent, to sit in the back, to fade away." Back at home, Marilyn stayed away from the noise. She didn't go online. She didn't answer the phone when reporters began to call. She didn't care to see the headlines. What did it matter now? Still, word reached her. Sheila came by one afternoon holding her phone in one hand, still shaking her head. "Girl, you're everywhere," she said with a laugh that didn't hide the tears in her eyes. "You've got the whole world listening. You did that." Marilyn smiled. "I wasn't trying to make a statement." Sheila sat beside her, placing a hand over hers. "That's what makes it so powerful." They sipped sweet tea together on the porch, watching the light drift through the trees, saying very little. The air smelled of honeysuckle. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and it reminded Marilyn of the days when David was young and the world was small and full of promise. The silence after Sheila left was full of meaning, not emptiness. It didn't feel like waiting. It felt like release. David never called. She knew he wouldn't. Pride had always been his armor. Shame was something he didn't know how to wear. But she heard through whispers from mutual acquaintances and an anonymous message from one of the wedding staff that Victoria had left him within the week. Her parents had pulled financial support. His firm had distanced itself from the scandal. He had tried to contest the will. He had failed. It was ironclad. Gloria had made sure of it. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the wedding, Marilyn pulled a suitcase from the top shelf of her closet. It was old, with worn leather handles and a brass clasp that stuck slightly when opened. Inside, she packed only the essentials, a few dresses, the dove brooch, her Bible, and the first letter she had ever written to David, the one she had decided to keep. She added a handful of photos, the ones that showed her young and vibrant with her head thrown back in laughter. No pictures of him. She left a final note on Gloria's kitchen counter the next morning, placed beneath her spare house key. It read simply, "It's done. Thank you. Don't look for me. I'm not lost." She left quietly. No farewell parties, no dramatic exit. She had already said what she needed to say. 2 days later, Marilyn was living in a coastal village in southern Spain under a different name. The sea was blue and wild. The breeze smelled of oranges and salt. Her neighbors knew her only as Ellie. She rented a small stone house with blue shutters and an overgrown courtyard where mint and basil thrived in the sunlight. Each morning, she walked to the market with a woven basket. She bought bread, still warm from the oven, and flowers from a stall run by a girl who reminded her of the nurses she had trained long ago, sharp, funny, unafraid. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't need to. She had her peace. The world, back in the States, still told her story. Foundations were named after her. Scholarships funded. Her face, though she hadn't sought it, appeared on posters and digital campaigns for dignity and elder care. Writers tried to describe her. Activists called her a symbol. But Marilyn had no interest in being a symbol. She was just a woman who had drawn a line. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, she sat in the courtyard with a blanket over her knees and a cup of tea beside her. She watched the sun move through the leaves. She listened to the rustle of palm trees, and she thought about nothing at all. One evening, as the sky turned the color of copper and rose, she reached into the folds of her scarf and touched the brooch. She smiled, a small, secret smile. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't grieving. She was free. And somewhere, far away, David lived with silence. It was the only inheritance she had left him. The sun rose softly over the tiled rooftops of the small Spanish village, brushing the sea in liquid gold. Morning light filtered into the courtyard of Marilyn's modest home, dappling the mint and basil she had planted along the crumbling stone walls. The scent of earth and salt mixed in the air as she sat beneath an overgrown olive tree, sipping her tea slowly, as she did every morning, her blanket folded neatly over her knees. The sea breeze kissed her cheeks, cool and kind, and the only sound was the rustle of the branches overhead. She had learned to love silence in a new way here, not the aching kind she had known in her Atlanta home, where every creaking floorboard had reminded her of absence. This was different. This silence was peace. It was the absence of expectation, of judgment, of shame. It was the space she had carved out for herself with no intention of ever surrendering it again. Her neighbors called her Ellie, a name she had offered without hesitation or explanation. They never asked where she had come from, only who she was now. A retired teacher, she had said once, a widow, a quiet woman who liked flowers and fresh bread and the sound of rain. All of it true in some way, and none of it enough to touch the history she had left behind. That she had buried like a seed. And in this strange new soil, something else had grown. The weeks had passed gently. She walked to the market each Tuesday and Friday, chatting with vendors in a halting blend of English and Spanish. She had even begun learning the language properly, attending small lessons offered by a retired professor down the road, trading homemade jam for grammar corrections. Her mind, despite the weight of years and illness, was still sharp. She took pleasure in small victories, conjugating a verb correctly, haggling for ripe tomatoes, making the little girl at the flower stall laugh. The village accepted her as easily as the stones accepted moss. She tended her garden, baked, wrote in a journal she never planned to show anyone, and drank her tea with a kind of reverence. Her body still betrayed her now and then, tiredness sweeping in like a tide, her breath shallow on some mornings, her heart fluttering in ways she could no longer ignore. But she had come to understand that none of it frightened her anymore. She had already done what she came to do. Back in the States, the world had kept moving. The last update she had allowed herself came in the form of a letter from Gloria, forwarded to the address she had given her friend on a torn scrap of paper. The envelope had arrived with Spanish stamps added over the American ones, crinkled from travel. Inside was a photo of the newly renamed Massey Hall, a modest building lined with flowers and framed by a bronze plaque that bore her full name. Marilyn Vivian James. Mother, nurse, donor, builder. Underneath the photo was a brief note from Gloria. They started calling it the house she built. Even the new residents say your name like a prayer. You did good. Rest if you need. You're home now. Marilyn had sat with the letter for hours, her fingers brushing the paper again and again. She hadn't cried. Not exactly. But a single tear had rolled down her cheek, leaving a cool trail, as if her body needed to let go of something just one last time. David had never written. He had never called. She hadn't expected him to, but she had imagined, in some small, flickering corner of herself, that he might try, that he might write a single line, that he might ask if she was alive, that he might admit, in his own polished way, that he had been wrong. Instead, the only echoes of him came through the stories that reached her by way of the internet, stories she never read directly, but which found their way to her regardless. A former employee at his firm leaked the truth of what had happened, how he had tried to challenge the will, how he had stood alone on the courthouse steps after being dismissed. Another article mentioned Victoria's swift departure, how she had taken everything she could and moved on. Commentators speculated about his fall, about how a man so seemingly powerful could lose everything over pride and a single, cruel decision. The world had drawn its own conclusions, and Marilyn had let it. The day she officially changed her legal name to Ellie Massey, she signed the papers with steady hands and smiled at the notary who did not know who she had once been. A simple transaction, no fanfare. She returned home afterward and sat in the courtyard listening to the sea and whispered to herself, "Now no one owns my story but me." It was that week that she began planting again. Not just herbs this time, but flowers. White lilies, daffodils, and roses. Her courtyard bloomed beneath her fingers, as if the ground itself understood that something sacred had happened there. Each morning, she watered the plants with the same cup she drank her tea from. It was a small act of devotion, a reminder that life continued even after everything else fell away. One afternoon, a local journalist came to the market looking for her, a young woman with wide eyes and soft hands carrying a notepad and questions. "Are you the American woman who gave it all away?" she asked, her voice tentative, respectful. "The one who disappeared?" Marilyn had looked at her for a long moment and simply replied, "No, you must be thinking of someone else." And then she had walked away, her basket full of oranges and thyme, her scarf catching the wind like a flag. Later, she had laughed to herself as she chopped fruit for a tart, not from amusement, but from the deep relief of being unknown. It was a kind of freedom she hadn't known she wanted. To be seen not as the woman who had been wronged, but as the woman who had chosen to live anyway. That evening, she wrote one final letter. Not to David. Not to Gloria. To herself. You did not die when they forgot you. You did not vanish when they closed the door. You did not fade when they looked away. You lived. You chose light. You chose yourself. She folded the letter, placed it in her Bible, and closed it. A week later, she was invited to speak at the dedication of a new shelter branch in Barcelona. The foundation had sent a formal invitation offering to fly her in to celebrate her name, her story. The gesture was kind, heartfelt. She read it 3 times. And then, as she always did, she declined. She didn't need a podium. She had already said everything worth saying without ever raising her voice. The scarf she had left behind on the wedding chair, the one in the 3rd row, blue with silver threading, had apparently been found and framed by one of the wedding staff who later donated it to the foundation. It now hung in the main hallway of Massey Hall beneath a simple inscription, "Let her be seen now." Marilyn never asked to see a photo of the display. She didn't need to. She knew what it looked like. In her dreams, sometimes she saw it as a banner in the wind, stretched wide, undulating like a sea of memory. Other nights, she dreamed of her younger self, standing in a hospital hallway in scrubs too big, holding a lunchbox with her son's name written in marker, smiling because she had found a moment of rest. And in those dreams, David never turned away. But even in her dreams, she never spoke to him again. Not because she couldn't, because she no longer needed to. The resurrection she had undergone was not one of revenge or reclamation, but one of restoration. She had not risen to destroy. She had risen to breathe. And now, in the soft cradle of this coastal village with the sea humming her name, Marilyn, Ellie, Massey lived quietly, fully, without apology. On the first day of spring, she woke before dawn and lit a candle in the courtyard, not for anyone else, just for herself. The flame danced gently in the wind, small but unyielding. She sat beside it, hands wrapped around her tea, her blanket warm across her lap. And as the light spilled over the walls and the birds began to sing, she whispered aloud, not for a crowd, not for a camera, but for the soil, the sky, and the memory of everything she had survived. I am not gone. I am still growing. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and share this one with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.